humiliated, rejected, and betrayed by her fiancé and her own sister for being deaf, until the Apache uncovered something impossible. Because sometimes, the ones who can't hear are the only ones who truly understand. The betrayal of those who should have loved her didn't just break her heart. It unearthed the darkest secrets of a respected family and exposed a truth buried for decades. A secret that would prove that sometimes the cruelest wounds are the ones that teach us how to heal. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And have you ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most? Let me know in the comments. New Mexico Territory, 1873. Clara had been born into silence, but she'd learned to read the world through other senses. The vibration of footsteps told her who approached. The shift in air currents warned her of storms. The expressions on faces revealed truths that spoken words often hid, but no amount of observation could have prepared her for the truth her family hid from her. She was the younger daughter of Samuel Whitmore, owner of the largest ranch in the territory. Her sister Victoria was everything Clara wasn't: hearing, beautiful, admired. Their mother Elizabeth had died when Clara was 10, and with her went the only person who'd ever looked at Clara with love instead of disappointment. "Why can't you be more like Victoria?" Her father's lips would form, the words Clara had learned to read through years of practice. Why did God curse me with a defective daughter? Defective. That word appeared on her father's lips more times than Clara could count. She learned to make herself small, useful, invisible. She cooked, cleaned, managed the household accounts better than Victoria ever could, but it was never enough. Then Thomas arrived, a neighboring rancher's son, handsome and kind, or so Clara thought. He was one of the few people who tried to communicate with her, writing notes, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. When he asked her father for permission to court her, Clara's heart soared. "I see you, Clara," he wrote on a piece of paper one evening. "Not your deafness. You." For the first time since her mother died, Clara felt seen, valued, loved. When Thomas proposed 6 months later, she said yes, with tears streaming down her face. Finally, she would have a family again, a home where she belonged. The wedding was planned for spring. Clara spent months preparing, sewing her own dress, planning every detail. Victoria helped, or pretended to. She smiled, offered suggestions, acted like the supportive older sister. But Clara noticed things, the way Victoria's hand would linger on Thomas's arm, the secretive looks between them, the times she'd enter a room and find them jumping apart, guilty expressions on their faces. She pushed the observations away. She was being paranoid, jealous of her sister's ease in the hearing world. Thomas loved her. He'd said so in a dozen letters she kept pressed in her Bible. The night before the wedding, Thomas disappeared. His family said he'd gone to the next town for supplies. Clara waited at the ranch, her wedding dress hanging ready, her hope beginning to crack. He didn't return that night, or the next morning. By noon, when guests began arriving at the church, Clara stood in her wedding dress, clutching her bouquet, watching the door, waiting, praying she was wrong about the sick feeling in her stomach. Then the church doors opened. Thomas walked in, dressed in his wedding suit. But he wasn't alone. His hand was wrapped around Victoria's. Her sister wore a beautiful dress, not quite a wedding gown, but close enough, and on her face was a smile of pure triumph. Clara felt the floor tilt. The guests' mouths opened in shock. She couldn't hear their gasps, but she could see them, could read the scandal on every face. Her father stood from his seat, face purple with rage, but that rage wasn't directed at Victoria or Thomas. Thomas walked to the front of the church and spoke. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she could read his lips as he faced the crowd. "I'm sorry for the confusion, but I've realized my true feelings. Victoria and I are in love. We're asking for your blessing to marry instead." The church erupted. Clara stood frozen, bouquet trembling in her hands. Victoria turned to look at her, and for just a moment, Clara saw something like guilt flicker across her sister's face. But it vanished quickly, replaced by defiance. Samuel stormed down the aisle. His lips moved rapidly, and Clara caught fragments. Embarrassed, disgrace, scandal. But his anger wasn't at the sister who'd stolen a fiancé. It was at Clara, for being foolish enough to think someone would actually want to marry her. He grabbed Clara's arm, yanked her toward the door. She stumbled, her carefully arranged hair coming loose, her veil falling to the floor. The guests parted like water. Some looked pitying, others looked relieved. One less awkward situation to navigate. Outside, Samuel shoved Clara toward their wagon. His lips moved in words she'd seen before. "Pack your things. You're no longer welcome in my house. You've brought enough shame on this family." "But father," Clara tried to sign to speak with her hands, but he turned away. He'd never learned her language, never tried. "You have until tonight," he said, speaking to someone else, a ranch hand who nodded. "Then I want her gone." Clara returned to the ranch in a daze. The house that had been her prison now refused to be even that. She packed a small bag, clothes, her mother's locket, the few dollars she'd saved from managing the household accounts. As the sun set, she stood in the doorway of the only home she'd ever known. No one came to say goodbye. Not her father, not the household staff, and certainly not Victoria, who was probably celebrating her victory with Thomas. Clara walked into the desert as darkness fell. She had no destination, no plan. She just walked, letting the vast emptiness swallow her whole. Maybe the desert would be kinder than her family. Maybe silence would finally feel like peace instead of punishment. She didn't know that someone was watching, following, waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth 20 years in the making. Clara walked through the night, guided only by moonlight and the ancient instinct to keep moving. If she stopped, she'd have to think, to feel, to acknowledge that everything she'd believed about her life had been a lie. By dawn, she was exhausted. Her feet bled in her delicate wedding shoes. Her dress was torn and dusty. She'd finished her small canteen of water hours ago. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, beautiful and merciless. She found a cluster of rocks offering shade and collapsed there. Her body shook, not from cold, but from the shock finally breaking through. She'd lost everything, her family, her home, her future. And the worst part? A small, cruel voice in her head whispered that she deserved it, that her father was right. Who would want to marry a defective girl? No. Clara pushed the thought away violently. She wasn't defective. She was different. Her mother had taught her that. "God doesn't make mistakes, Clara," Elizabeth would sign with patient hands. "He makes miracles. And you are mine." But her mother was gone. And with her, any protection Clara had in that house. She should have seen it coming. Victoria had always been jealous of any attention Clara received. And Thomas. Clara forced herself to remember the signs she'd ignored, the way his kindness had felt performative, the way he'd never really learned to communicate with her beyond basic words, the way he'd seemed relieved when Victoria was around to translate, to fill the silences he didn't know how to bridge. He hadn't loved her. He'd loved the idea of being the noble man who married the disabled girl, until a better option presented itself. Victoria, beautiful, hearing, desirable, and probably offering him something Clara, in her innocence, hadn't. The sun climbed higher. Clara's lips cracked with thirst. She knew she should find water, find shelter, find a way to survive. But part of her wondered why. What was there to survive for? She had no skills the world valued, no family to return to, no future to build toward. She closed her eyes and let the heat wash over her. Maybe this was mercy. Maybe the desert would take her gently, and she'd wake up with her mother again in a place where silence was holy instead of shameful. She didn't know how long she drifted in and out of consciousness. Minutes? Hours? The sun burned overhead, relentless. Her tongue felt thick and swollen. Dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. Then, a shadow fell across her face. Clara's eyes fluttered open. A figure stood silhouetted against the sun, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably male. For a moment, terror cut through her delirium. Bandits were common in this territory, and a woman alone, dressed in the remnants of a wedding gown, would be an easy target. But the figure didn't attack. He knelt beside her, and Clara saw him clearly for the first time. Apache. Young, maybe mid-20s, with dark eyes that held something unexpected, recognition, and concern. He reached for his water skin and held it to her lips. Clara drank desperately, some of the water spilling down her chin. He let her drink, then gently pulled the water away before she could make herself sick. His lips moved. Clara shook her head, pointing to her ears. Understanding crossed his face. He set the water aside and began to use his hands. Not formal sign language, but gestures. Universal communication. He pointed to her, made a questioning gesture, then pointed toward the horizon where the town lay. Clara shook her head violently. Not going back, never going back. She made an X with her arms, the universal symbol for no. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeing too much. Then he nodded. He made a gesture that she understood. Come with me. Safe. Clara hesitated. She knew the stories about Apaches. The frontier was full of them. Tales of raids, kidnappings, violence. But looking into this man's eyes, she saw none of that. She saw something else. Something that reminded her painfully of her mother. Compassion. And what did she have to lose? If he killed her, at least it would be quick. If he saved her, maybe she'd find a reason to keep living. She nodded. He helped her stand, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out. He gestured toward a horse waiting in the shade of nearby rocks. He lifted her onto it, with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins steady and sure. As they rode away from the rocks where Clara had been prepared to die, she looked back once. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of the town, the church steeple, the ranch where she'd grown up. It all looked small from here, insignificant. Good. Let it fade. Let it disappear. Let her old life die in the desert heat. She was Clara no longer. She was someone new, someone who would learn to survive. She didn't know yet that the man holding her on the horse knew exactly who she was, that he'd been watching her family for years, waiting for the right moment, that her mother's death had left a debt unpaid, and he'd sworn on his own mother's grave to honor it. She didn't know that her rescue wasn't chance. It was destiny, and the truth about his connection to her family would change everything she thought she knew about her past. But for now, she let herself lean back against his chest and feel for the first time in days safe. They rode for hours into territory Clara had never seen. The Apache, she didn't know his name yet, guided the horse with expert precision through canyons and across streams, always moving away from civilization. Clara should have been afraid. Instead, she felt oddly calm. Whatever happened next, it couldn't be worse than what she'd left behind. As the sun began to set, they arrived at a small camp hidden in a box canyon. It was temporary, just a shelter made of branches and hides, a fire pit, supplies. Clearly, he'd been living here alone for some time. He helped her down from the horse and guided her to sit near where a fire would be built. Then he moved efficiently, gathering wood, starting flames with practiced ease. Clara watched him work, noticing details. He was young, probably only a few years older than her. His movements were economical, purposeful, and most importantly, he kept glancing at her, checking to make sure she was comfortable. Once the fire was burning, he heated water and brought her food, dried meat, some kind of bread or cake. It wasn't much, but to Clara's starving body it tasted like heaven. He sat across from her and ate his own portion, giving her space but staying close enough to help if needed. When they finished eating, he did something unexpected. He pulled out a stick and began drawing in the dirt. First, he drew a simple figure with a dress, pointing to Clara. She nodded. Then he drew another figure, this one clearly male, and pointed to himself. Then he drew letters. N-A-S-H-O-B-A. Clara's eyes widened. He could write. She pointed to the letters, questioningly. He nodded, then made a gesture like a wolf howling. Nashoba. Wolf. His name was Wolf. Clara smiled for the first time in days. She took the stick from him and wrote her own name, C-L-A-R-A. He studied it, then looked up at her. His lips formed the word carefully. Clara. She couldn't hear it, but seeing her name on his lips felt like a gift. They spent the evening teaching each other. He would point to objects, fire, water, horse, sky, and show her the Apache sign. She would show him the signs she knew from the system she and her mother had developed. They were different languages, but somehow they found ways to bridge the gap. As night fell and the fire burned low, Nashoba gestured for her to sleep in the shelter. He would keep watch outside. Clara wanted to protest, but exhaustion won. She crawled into the shelter and found it surprisingly comfortable. Soft hides, clean blankets. Someone had prepared this carefully. She lay there in the darkness, wondering about this strange Apache who'd rescued her. Why was he alone? Why had he been in that part of the desert? And why was he being so kind to a white woman when relations between their peoples were so fraught? Sleep took her before she found answers. Over the next several days, a routine developed. Nashoba would hunt or gather food. Clara would maintain the camp, cook, mend. They were each self-sufficient, but together they worked seamlessly. And every evening they would sit by the fire and teach each other. Clara learned that Nashoba had been tracking her family's ranch for weeks, not to raid. She understood that clearly from his gestures, but to watch. When she asked why, his face became solemn. He drew in the dirt again. A woman. A child. Then he made the sign for death and pointed to himself as the child. Then he drew Clara's father. She recognized the figure by the distinctive hat Samuel always wore. Nashoba made a shooting gesture. Clara's blood ran cold. Her father had killed Nashoba's parents? Nashoba nodded slowly. But then he drew another figure, a woman with long hair. He made the sign for kindness, for protection. He pointed to Clara, then to himself as a baby. This woman had saved him. Clara understood. Her mother, Elizabeth. She'd saved Nashoba when he was a child. Somehow, during whatever violence had occurred, her mother had protected him. Clara's hands trembled as she pointed to the woman figure, then to herself. Her mother. Nashoba nodded. His eyes held deep sadness, but also gratitude. He made a gesture of promise, of protection. He'd sworn to watch over Elizabeth's family, to protect her daughter. Tears streamed down Clara's face. Her mother had saved this man's life, and now, 20 years later, he'd saved hers. The circle was complete. But there was more. Over the following days, as their communication grew more sophisticated, Nashoba told her the whole story. 20 years ago, her father and other ranchers had attacked an Apache camp, claiming it was in retaliation for stolen cattle. But Nashoba's family had stolen nothing. They'd been peaceful. His father was a healer, his mother a teacher. Elizabeth Whitmore had been there that day, bringing medical supplies to the Apache camp, something she did secretly against her husband's wishes. When the attack began, she'd grabbed baby Nashoba and hidden him in her wagon. She'd told the other ranchers she'd searched and found no survivors. She'd saved his life and kept his existence secret. Before she died, Elizabeth had made Nashoba promise something. Not revenge. She'd begged him not to seek that. But protection. If anything happens to me, she'd told him years ago when they'd met secretly to continue his education, watch over my daughter, the deaf one. She'll need someone. Nashoba had kept that promise. He'd watched from a distance as Clara grew up. He'd seen her father's coldness, Victoria's cruelty, Thomas's betrayal, and when Clara fled into the desert, he'd been there, waiting, ready to honor his debt. Clara looked at this man who owed her nothing but had given her everything. She reached across the fire and took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated touch. Nashoba's eyes widened, but he didn't pull away. They sat there, hands clasped, two people from different worlds connected by tragedy and saved by grace. That night, Clara understood something profound. She'd been looking for love in all the wrong places. Thomas had offered her pretty words, but no real understanding. Her family had offered her a home, but no acceptance. But Nashoba, who couldn't speak her language and whom she'd known only days, saw her. Really saw her. Not despite her deafness, but including it, as part of who she was. For the first time since her mother died, Clara felt truly understood. The days blended together in the canyon, each one bringing Clara and Nashoba closer. They developed their own unique language, a blend of Apache signs, Clara's gestures, drawings in the dirt, and an increasingly sophisticated system of expressions and touches. Clara learned that Nashoba was surprisingly educated. Her mother had taught him to read and write English during their secret meetings. He'd learned Spanish from traders. He could speak 3 languages fluently, though Clara would never hear any of them. But watching his face as he communicated was its own kind of music. One evening, as the sun painted the canyon walls golden red, Nashoba did something unexpected. He pulled out a small drum Clara hadn't seen before. He looked at her questioningly, and she nodded, curious. He began to play. Clara couldn't hear the beats, but she could feel them. The vibrations traveled through the ground, up through her body. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm wash over her. It wasn't the same as hearing, she knew that, but it was something. It was his way of sharing music with her. When he finished, Clara opened her eyes to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took her hand. He placed it over his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating, steady, strong, quick. He pointed to her, then to himself, then placed his hand over his heart again. Clara understood. Her own heart was racing to match his. She took his hand and placed it over her chest, letting him feel her heartbeat in return. This was their symphony, not notes and melodies, but the fundamental rhythm of 2 lives beginning to synchronize. That night marked a shift. They were no longer just survivor and rescuer. They were something more, something neither had words for in any language. The next morning, Clara woke to find Nashoba already up, working on something. As she emerged from the shelter, she saw he'd fashioned a more permanent structure, a proper dwelling that would be more comfortable long-term. The message was clear. They weren't leaving. This was becoming home. Clara helped him work, and they fell into an easy rhythm. He would lift the heavy poles into place, she would secure the bindings, he would gather materials, she would weave them together. They worked as a unit, anticipating each other's needs without speaking. As they worked, Clara found herself noticing things about Nashoba she hadn't before. The way his hair fell across his face when he concentrated, the strength in his arms as he lifted logs, the gentle way he handled even the smallest tasks, the patience in his eyes when teaching her something new. And she noticed him noticing her, the way his gaze would linger when she smiled, how his hand would steady her when she climbed, the care he took to make sure she was comfortable, fed, safe. One afternoon, as they rested in the shade, Nashoba pulled out paper, precious and carefully preserved, and began to write. Clara watched as words appeared in neat script. Your mother spoke of you often. She said you saw the world differently than others, that you noticed things they missed because you couldn't rely on hearing. She said you were gifted, not cursed. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She took the pencil from him and wrote back, she was the only one who thought so. Nashoba wrote again, she was right. I watch you. You see everything. The way light changes, how animals move, people's true feelings in their faces. You see what hearing people miss because they rely too much on words. Words lie. Eyes and hearts don't. Clara had never thought of it that way. Her deafness had always been presented as a deficit, but Nashoba framed it as a different kind of perception. Not less, just different. She wrote, why are you being so kind to me? His response came slowly, each word carefully chosen. Because your mother saved my life, because you deserve kindness, and because when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it means to live between 2 worlds. You are not fully part of the hearing world, but not separate from it either. I am Apache, but I was raised partly by a white woman. We both stand in the spaces between. Maybe that's where we belong. Together. Clara's hand shook as she wrote back, what happens when my family comes looking for me? When the people from town realize where I am? Nashoba's jaw set firmly. He wrote, they won't find you if you don't want to be found. And if they do, I will protect you. This I swear. But even as he wrote it, they both knew it wasn't that simple. The territory was growing more settled. Tensions between Apaches and white settlers were increasing. A white woman living with an Apache man would be seen as either kidnapped or worse. And Clara's family, despite their rejection, might still claim ownership of her fate. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara made a decision. She took Neshoba's hand and looked him in the eyes. Using every gesture, expression and touch she knew, she communicated what she couldn't say in words. I choose this. I choose you. I choose us. Whatever comes, I'm not leaving. Neshoba understood. He pulled her close, and for the first time, she rested her head on his shoulder. She felt safe, seen, valued. All the things she desperately wanted Thomas to make her feel, but never had. Because Thomas had wanted to rescue her from her deafness, Neshoba simply wanted her, deafness and all. He didn't see something to fix, he saw someone to love. And Clara realized something profound. Real love doesn't ask you to be different. It celebrates who you already are. As the stars wheeled overhead in their silent dance, Clara felt peace settle into her bones. She'd lost everything, family, home, future. But in losing it all, she'd found something better. She'd found herself, and she'd found someone who loved that self unconditionally. The past was behind her. The future was uncertain. But in that moment, wrapped in Neshoba's arms, Clara was exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks passed in their canyon sanctuary. Clara had never been happier. She and Neshoba had developed a life together, simple, peaceful, full of small joys. He taught her to track animals by their marks in the dirt. She taught him recipes her mother had known. They communicated through their evolving language of gestures, expressions, and the intimate shorthand that develops between two people in love. Then, one morning, Neshoba's posture changed. He'd been scanning the horizon as he always did, but now his body went rigid. Clara stood and came to his side. Following his gaze, she saw distant figures on horseback, 3 of them heading toward the canyon. Neshoba turned to Clara, his face serious. He gestured quickly. Hide, danger, men coming. But Clara shook her head. She wouldn't hide. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. She touched his arm and stood firm beside him. As the riders drew closer, Clara's stomach sank. She recognized them. Her father Samuel leading the group, Thomas looking uncomfortable, and a man she didn't know, probably a tracker they'd hired. The men rode into the canyon and stopped a distance away. Samuel dismounted, his face a mix of anger and something else. Relief? Clara wasn't sure. Clara. Her father's lips formed her name. Thank God. We've been searching for weeks. Come here, daughter. It's time to come home. Clara didn't move. She stepped closer to Neshoba instead. Her father's eyes narrowed. Clara, that's an Apache. He's probably the one who took you. You're not thinking clearly. Come away from him. Thomas dismounted too. Clara, please, I know you're angry about the wedding. We can talk about this, but you can't stay out here. It's not safe. Not safe. The irony would have made Clara laugh if she weren't so tense. She'd never been safer than she was with Neshoba. But how could she explain that to them? She stepped forward, away from Neshoba, and began to sign clearly and deliberately. She didn't care that her father had never learned her language. She needed to say this in the way that felt truest. Neshoba could translate if needed. Her hands moved. I am not kidnapped. I chose to leave. I chose him. I am staying here. Samuel looked at Neshoba. What's she saying? Before Neshoba could respond, Thomas stepped forward. Clara, be reasonable. Whatever happened at the wedding, Victoria and I, we made a mistake. We were confused, but that doesn't mean you should throw your life away out here. Clara's hands moved again, sharper now. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose each other. I choose him. Her hands pointed clearly at Neshoba. Savage doesn't understand your damaged goods now, Samuel said bluntly. No white man will have you after this. But we can say you were kidnapped, held captive, salvage your reputation, bring you home. Neshoba spoke then, his English clear and precise, something that clearly shocked all 3 men. Clara is not damaged. She is not captive. She is free. More free than she ever was in your house. Samuel's face flushed. You speak English. See, Clara's mother taught me. Elizabeth Whitmore, your wife, the woman who saved my life when I was a child after you slaughtered my family. The silence was deafening. Samuel's face went from red to pale. That was different. That was a raid. We were defending our property. My family had stolen nothing. We were peaceful. You attacked because you wanted our land." Neshoba's voice was steady, not angry, just stating facts. "Elizabeth knew this. She saved me, raised me partially, made me promise to protect her daughter if anything happened to her. I am keeping that promise." Samuel looked at Clara, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. "Is this true? Did your mother know this? This man?" Clara nodded. She pulled out the locket she always wore, her mother's locket. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph. She handed it to her father. In the photo, a young Elizabeth stood next to a boy, clearly Apache, clearly Neshoba. Samuel stared at the photograph, his hands shaking. "She never told me. All those years." "Because you would have killed him," Clara signed, her hands sharp and angry. Neshoba translated, his voice calm. Thomas stepped forward, trying a different approach. "Clara, even if all of that's true, what kind of life can you have here? You're educated, refined. You belong in society, not in a canyon." Clara's response was swift and clear. "I belong where I am loved, not where I am tolerated." The words, translated by Neshoba, hit Thomas visibly. He flinched. "I did care for you. I do care for you." Clara shook her head. She pulled out paper and pencil, the ones Neshoba had given her, and wrote quickly, handing the paper to Thomas. "How you cared for the idea of being noble by marrying the deaf girl. But you never learned to truly communicate with me. In 3 weeks, Neshoba has understood me better than you did in 6 months. That's not love, that's pity. And I deserve more than pity." Thomas read the words and had no response, because they were true and all 3 men knew it. Samuel cleared his throat. "Clara, I'm still your father. You're still my responsibility. I can't just leave you out here." Clara wrote again and handed the paper to Neshoba to read aloud. "You stopped being my father the day you threw me out for a humiliation I didn't cause. You chose Victoria over me. You chose your pride over your daughter. I am no longer your responsibility. I release you from it. But society, what will people think?" Clara wrote one final note. "Tell them I died in the desert. Let me be dead to that world, because I am dead to you. And that world was killing me anyway. Here, I am alive." Samuel stood there, the weight of his choices visibly crushing him. For a moment, Clara saw something in his face, regret perhaps, the recognition of everything he'd lost by being too proud to love an imperfect daughter. Thomas spoke quietly. "I'm sorry, Clara, for all of it. You deserve better than I gave you. I hope you find happiness." It wasn't much, but it was something. Clara nodded, acknowledging his words without forgiving them. Some wounds were too deep for easy healing. The tracker, who'd been silent this whole time, finally spoke. "Sam, we should go. She's made her choice. She's an adult. And honestly," he looked at Neshoba and Clara standing together, hands clasped. "She looks happier than I've seen any woman in town look in years." Samuel mounted his horse slowly, looking years older than when he'd arrived. He looked at Clara one last time. "If you ever need anything, if you ever want to come home." Clara shook her head firmly. This was home now, here, in a canyon, with a man who saw her completely and loved her anyway. The 3 men rode away, leaving Clara and Neshoba alone once more. As the dust settled, Clara turned to Neshoba. Tears streamed down her face, not from sadness, but from release. That chapter was closed. Those ghosts were laid to rest. Neshoba pulled her close and she buried her face in his chest. She felt his heart beating steady and strong. He was her home, her family, her future. And she was finally, truly free. A month passed. Clara and Neshoba's life together deepened. They'd improved their dwelling, expanded their garden, and created a life that was surprisingly rich despite its simplicity. Clara had never imagined she could be so content. Then, one afternoon, a lone figure appeared at the entrance to the canyon. A woman, walking slowly, carrying a bundle. As she drew closer, Clara's breath caught. Victoria. Neshoba moved to intercept, protective, but Clara placed a hand on his arm. "Wait, let me see what she wants." Victoria looked terrible. Her beautiful dress was dirty and torn. Her face was pale and drawn. And her belly, Clara's eyes widened, her belly was swollen with pregnancy. At least 6 months along, Victoria stopped a respectful distance away. Her voice carried across the space, and though Clara couldn't hear the words, she could read her sister's lips clearly. Please, please, I need help. Neshoba looked at Clara questioningly. She could send Victoria away, could turn her back the way Victoria had turned on her. It would be justified, fair even. But Clara thought of her mother. Elizabeth had saved Neshoba despite the danger, despite her husband's anger. She'd believed in mercy, in second chances, in forgiveness, not because people deserved it, but because carrying hatred poisoned the one who held it. Clara nodded to Neshoba. He relaxed slightly, but remained alert. Victoria approached slowly, like an animal uncertain of its welcome. When she reached them, she dropped to her knees. Her lips moved in words Clara read easily. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clara waited. Victoria needed to explain, needed to account for what she'd done. Victoria's hands shook as she pulled out paper and pencil, the same technique Thomas had used, and began to write. Her hand moved shakily but legibly. Thomas left me. 3 months after we married. He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd only married me because I was beautiful and would make him look good. When I got pregnant, he said it wasn't his problem. He took everything and left. Father wouldn't take me back, said I'd made my choice. I have nowhere to go, no money, no home. I know I don't deserve your help. I know what I did to you was unforgivable. But I'm begging you, not for me, for this baby, please. Clara read the words twice. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, to say, I told you so, to send Victoria back to face the consequences of her choices alone. But another part, the part that sounded like her mother, whispered different words. She took the pencil from Victoria and wrote, Why did you do it? Why did you take Thomas from me? Victoria's hands trembled as she wrote back, Because I was jealous. You couldn't hear, but everyone loved you anyway. Mother loved you more than me. You were kind and good and patient. I was just pretty. And when Thomas showed interest in you, I couldn't stand it. I wanted to prove I could take anything from you, that I was better. I was cruel and stupid and wrong, and I'm sorry. I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have. Clara stood there, reading those words, feeling the weight of them. Victoria's confession didn't erase the pain, didn't undo the humiliation, but it was honest, raw, real. She looked at Neshoba. He was watching her carefully, letting her make this choice. She signed to him. What would my mother do? Neshoba's response was immediate. She would show mercy. Clara closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Forgiveness wasn't about Victoria deserving it. It was about Clara choosing not to let bitterness poison her new life. She could help Victoria without trusting her, could show mercy without forgetting. She opened her eyes and nodded. Victoria could stay, not as family. That bridge was burned, but as someone in need whom Clara had the power to help. Over the following weeks, an uneasy peace developed. Victoria stayed in a separate shelter Neshoba built. She helped with chores, cooked, and stayed quiet. She watched Clara and Neshoba's easy communication, their gentle affection, with something like wonder. One evening, as Clara and Victoria prepared food together, Victoria wrote on their shared slate, You're happy here, really happy. I've never seen you like this. Clara wrote back, Because he sees me, not my deafness, not what I can't do. Me. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She wrote, Thomas never saw me either. He saw a pretty face. I thought that was enough. But it's not, is it? Being seen for something shallow isn't the same as being seen for who you are. Clara wrote, No, it's not. They worked in silence for a while. Then Victoria wrote, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even forgive myself. But thank you for helping me anyway. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for. Clara wrote, Mother taught me that strength isn't about being hard. It's about being able to bend without breaking. You broke me once. But I grew back stronger in the broken places. Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. She wouldn't be Clara's sister again. Not really. Too much had happened. But maybe, in time, they could be something else. Two women who'd both been hurt by society's expectations and were learning slowly to heal. The baby was born on a cold November night. Victoria's labor was difficult, and Clara was grateful for everything Neshoba had taught her about healing. Together, they helped Victoria through it. When the baby finally arrived, a girl, Victoria held her daughter and wept. "I'll name her Elizabeth," Victoria said, looking at Clara, "after Mother. And I'll tell her about the aunt who saved us both." Clara nodded. It wasn't full reconciliation. It wasn't erasing the past, but it was something. A small beginning. A choice to let go of hate and choose something better. As Clara lay beside Neshoba that night, his arms around her, she felt something shift inside. The wound Victoria had opened wasn't fully healed, but it was healing. And Clara understood that forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It was a practice, a choice she'd have to make over and over, to let go, to move forward, to refuse to let the past poison the present. She'd been betrayed, humiliated, cast out, but those things no longer defined her. She was Clara, loved, whole, free, and that was enough. Spring came to the canyon, bringing wildflowers and new life. Clara stood at the entrance to their home, no longer a shelter, but a real house that she and Neshoba had built together, and marveled at how much had changed in less than a year. Victoria lived nearby with baby Elizabeth, independent but not isolated. She'd learned to make her own way, growing stronger every day. The relationship between the sisters wasn't what it had been in childhood. It was more honest, less tied to the roles their father had assigned them. They weren't close, but they were civil. And sometimes that was enough. One morning another visitor appeared. Samuel, alone this time, looking older and more humble than Clara had ever seen him. He approached slowly, his hat in his hands. Neshoba stood beside Clara, protective but not threatening. Samuel stopped a respectful distance away and spoke. Clara read his lips. "I came to apologize. To you both." He pulled out a paper and read from it. He'd written his speech down, knowing Clara would need to read his lips or see the words. His voice shook as he spoke. "Clara, I failed you as a father. I let pride and shame blind me to the gift I had in you. Your mother saw what I couldn't, that you were perfect exactly as you were. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel less than, every time I chose Victoria over you, every time I suggested you were a burden instead of a blessing." He turned to Neshoba. "And you, I took your family from you. I told myself it was necessary, that it was defense, but it was murder. Greed disguised as protection. Your mother and father were innocent. And mine, Elizabeth, tried to tell me that. Tried to make me see I wouldn't listen." He looked back at Clara. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know. I'm leaving the ranch to you. Both of you. It's the least I can do. It should have been yours anyway." Clara's eyes widened. She looked at Neshoba, who seemed equally surprised. She wrote quickly on slate and showed her father. "Why now? Why this?" Samuel's voice was heavy with grief. "Because I'm dying. Doctor says maybe 6 months. And I don't want to die knowing I left things like this. Knowing my daughter, my beautiful, strong, capable daughter, thought I hated her. I didn't hate you, Clara. I hated myself for not being able to protect you from a world that would judge you. But in trying to harden you for that world, I became one of the people hurting you. I'm sorry." Clara stood there, her father's words settling over her like snow. She'd imagined this apology so many times. In her fantasies, she'd been cold, unmoved. She'd make him suffer as she'd suffered. But now, facing his genuine remorse and mortality, Clara found she didn't want revenge. She wanted release. She wrote, "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because Mother would want me to, and because I refuse to carry hatred into my new life." Samuel's face crumpled. He nodded, unable to speak. Then he did something Clara never expected. He stepped forward and signed, clumsily, unpracticed, but clearly, 3 words he'd obviously learned. I love you. Clara's breath caught. Her father had learned to sign. After all these years, he'd finally tried to speak her language. It was late, so late, but it was something. She signed back, I love you too. They wouldn't have the relationship she'd once wanted. There wasn't time for that now. But they had this: reconciliation, peace, a chance to part without bitterness. Samuel left that day, and Clara never saw him alive again. He died 4 months later. Victoria brought the news. Clara grieved, but it was clean grief, uncomplicated by regret or anger. They'd said what needed to be said. True to his word, Samuel left them the ranch. Clara and Neshoba discussed it carefully. They could sell it, stay in their canyon. But Clara had a different idea. What if they turned it into something new? A place where Apache and white settlers could trade peacefully, where children like Clara, deaf or disabled, could find acceptance. A bridge between worlds. Neshoba loved the idea. Together, they began building that dream. Victoria joined them, bringing her own strength and determination. The ranch became known as a place of peace, of second chances, of acceptance. 1 year after their reunion, Neshoba and Clara stood together on the porch of their home, the ranch house renovated and transformed. Clara's hand rested on her own swelling belly, their child, due in the spring. Neshoba took her hand and placed it over his heart, their private language of love. She felt its steady beat and smiled. Then she placed his hand on her belly, and together they felt the flutter of new life. Their child would be born into a different world than either of them had known, a world where deaf and hearing lived together, where Apache and white worked side by side, where love was measured not by what people could do, but by who they chose to be. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice still existed, challenges remained, but they were building something better. One day, one choice, one act of grace at a time. As the sun set over the land that had witnessed so much pain and was now witnessing healing, Clara understood the full truth. She'd been humiliated and betrayed, cast out and rejected. But in losing everything, she'd found what she'd been searching for all along. Not a family that tolerated her, but one that celebrated her. Not love that pitied her limitations, but love that honored her strengths. Not a world that demanded she change, but a community that changed to include her. She'd been born into silence, but she'd learned that silence wasn't absence. It was a different kind of presence, a space where other forms of communication could flourish, where love could be expressed through touch, through gesture, through the steady beating of two hearts learning to synchronize. And that was the most beautiful music of all. She was humiliated and betrayed by her fiancé and sister for being deaf. But the Apache didn't just rescue her. He revealed that her mother had saved his life 20 years before, and in honoring that debt, he gave Clara something she'd never had. Someone who saw her not as broken, but as whole. Not as less than, but as exactly enough. Sometimes the people who wound us deepest teach us what we truly need. Not their love, which was never real, but the clarity to recognize real love when it finally arrives. Tell me, have you ever been betrayed by family? Have you ever had to choose between bitterness and healing? Have you ever discovered that your greatest pain led you to your greatest joy? If this story touched your heart, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that our disabilities, whatever they may be, don't define us. Our choices do. Our capacity for forgiveness does. Our courage to build something new from the ashes of what we've lost. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I love knowing these stories reach across borders and remind us all that love in its truest form speaks a universal language. Because some stories aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors, showing us who we are and who we could become if we're brave enough to let go of the past and embrace the future. We have a date with our next adventure.